Good evening and welcome to tonight's Hurley Heritage Society's March lecture. My name is Raleigh Green and I'm the Vice President of the organization and delighted to host this evening's presentation. Before we get started, a few quick notes. Please be sure you are on mute to ensure everyone can hear our guest speaker and that there are no interruptions during the presentation. If you have a question, you can use the chat feature to send your questions ahead of time, and they will be answered during the presentation or at the end. At the conclusion of the formal part of the presentation, we'll open things up for further questions, and at that time you can unmute yourselves. The presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the Hurley Heritage Society website in the coming days. Check the Facebook page or the website in the coming days and you'll see. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by, of course, the Hurley Heritage Society. For almost 50 years, the organization has maintained and operated the museum, which continues to be open and free to the public. We're an all-volunteer organization that protects and preserves materials, documents, and artifacts pertaining to Hurley and raises awareness and educates the public of the town's special heritage through events, lectures, programs, tours, and community initiatives. And I'd just like to make the announcement that please be sure to join us next Friday, March 31st at 7 o'clock for the Hurley Heritage Society's live benefit concert featuring Professor Louie and the Chromatics at the Hurley Reformed Church. Tickets are available through our website. That's hurleyheritagesociety.org. So tonight, without further ado, in recognition of Women's History Month, the Hurley Heritage Society welcomes Dr. Susan Lewis to give a talk and presentation on imagining colonial women in the Hudson Valley. The term colonial women conjures up visions of quaintly dressed women of European extraction, going about daily domestic chores like churning butter, hanging over a fireplace, stew pot, etc. But the women who lived in what would someday become New York State were a diverse group in terms of race, culture, religion, national background, and socioeconomic class. New York's colonial women ranged from indigenous people to those of the Western European descent, such as Dutch, English, French, Belgian, and German, amongst others. From religious refugees to enslaved Africans to capitalists. As in all periods, age and marital status also created diversity among women. Beginning with an overview of colonial New York, tonight's talk will focus on the many ways in which women shaped the history of the Hudson Valley between 1609 and 1775, and a short addendum on New York women's experiences in the American Revolution. Our presenter, Susan Ingalls Lewis, is a professor emerita in history and a former affiliate faculty member of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at SUNY New Paltz, where she taught courses in American history, women's history, and New York State history. With Emily Hamilton Honey, Dr. Lewis is the co-author of Girls to the Rescue, The Impact of World War I on Girls Series Fiction, McFarland and Company, 2020. She is also the author of Unexceptional Women, Female Proprietors in Mid-19th Century Albany, New York, from 1830 to 1885, Ohio State University Press, and co-editor of Suffrage and Its Limits, The New York Story, SUNY Press, 2020. Dr. Lewis is a fellow of the New York Academy of History and creator of the blog New York Rediscovered. She lives locally here in Rosendale, New York. Without further ado, welcome Professor Lewis.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, all right. It's delightful to see that we have so many participants because I was just in a conference in Detroit where I traveled all the way there, and I think maybe we had about 12 people in my panel. So this is far better, although I actually have somewhat less expertise on this subject, but hoping that I can share some ideas with you, and maybe you have some ideas to share with me. I'm going to share my screen now in any case. And okay, I'm going to share. I'm going to change to slideshow from beginning. All right, so is that working for everybody? We can see it? All right. So today I'm talking about colonial women in what would someday become New York State, because of course, New York State didn't exist in the colonial period. I'm going to have an emphasis on the Hudson Valley, broadly defined. So from New York City up through most of the Hudson Valley, not just the mid-Hudson Valley. I plan to go from 1609 to 1775, and if we have extra time, we'll go through some revolutionary women, but that will depend on the timing, which is always hard to figure out in advance. So what was New York? What is New York? I just want to start by arguing that in the colonial period, it's not only the areas of European settlement. As we know, New York stretches from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, from the harbor to the Hudson Valley, Lake George, Lake Champlain, and the Adirondacks. And all of that area had women in it, but they weren't all colonizing women. So yes, we'll talk about mostly the area that you're all in. I'm actually in Florida right now, but the area where we all live. So, common misconceptions about colonial women. Well, this picture, I think, says it all. You know, we have, I think, this picture of colonial women as this very cute, quaint little women dressed in Dutch costumes, and it's all very peaceful, and, you know, she's got a child, they're sort of chatting, everything's very rural, and it sort of assumes that colonial women anywhere in North America, but certainly in New York State, could be understood as a single entity, that there's such a thing as colonial women. And really, that's just a phrase that is full of diversity, especially in New York, which is one of the most diverse states in the colonies. You know, colonial women suggest that they were a homogeneous group, but they were not. Okay, I have a couple of other misconceptions I want to talk about. That colonial women had no rights. I actually read this on a website when I was doing some research. You know, well, you know, they couldn't own anything, they couldn't do anything, they couldn't go anywhere, they had to stay home. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we'll talk about that. And that they spent all their time, I always think my students imagine that women in the past spent all their time dusting, you know, dusting, cooking, cleaning, taking care of children. And that's not true either. So let's see what we've got here. I chose these pictures because I think they represent sort of stereotypes of colonial women. On the left, you see the woman with the spinning wheel and the spindle, and she's got a pot on the stove, and she's got a child. So she's covered all the bases. She is cooking, she is child caring, and she's, you know, spinning. In the picture in the middle, they're sewing, clearly. Both the women are sewing while the man reads the paper. And on the right, we have a very, you know, kind of meek and mild woman, again, spinning while she reads a book. Now, colonial women were really much more active than this. And I would argue less meek and mild. I also want to say that the two pictures on the edges are not from the colonial period at all. And as I discovered when I was doing the picture research for this talk, there are very few genuine pictures of colonial women in New York, even of famous women, much less sort of everyday women. So that's a challenge. And I always want to say that people, in terms of women and pictures of them, and pictures especially that we find on the web, need to be very suspicious, because when you Google an image, there is a 50% chance it's not a picture of what you're looking for, because I used to be a picture researcher, so I can tell. Here we have a picture on the left by Vermeer of a Dutch woman. That's fine, but it's not in New Netherlands, right? It's in Holland, and I find that many lectures about colonial women in New York are illustrated with just they found some picture of a woman in the Netherlands. Well, that's good enough. On the right, which I can't see for some reason, can other people see the picture on the right, or is it blocked by? Okay, that's better. Is a reenactor, and I would say that reenactors know a huge amount about history, particularly material history. And if you want to know something about the material history of colonial women in New York, a reenactor is the best person to talk to. In the middle here, we do have a painting from the colonial period of a very upper class woman in New York, but it's just because she's upper class and she is of the later period after 1750 that we have a portrait of her at all. So when you see images in any kind of talk, including mine, you want to take them with a grain of salt. All right, so what kind of diversity do we have? On the left here, we have actually an Iroquois woman from the Revolutionary period. Then we have some reenactors. They've got corn in the back, and that could even maybe be tobacco in the front, and they're, hoeing. And this is a woman and a man working together in the fields, which happens sometimes. We have, again, a very well-dressed, wealthy, aristocratic girl. And we have two African-American girls pounding cornmeal. So the lives of these women, obviously, they're in the same place, they're interacting with each other, but they're very different. Okay, even within these groups, there's a lot of variation. Not all indigenous women belong to the same tribe or language group. Some of them have languages that are extremely distinct and more different from each other than European languages were. Not all European women lived under the same legal system, as we'll see. French and Dutch women are under what was the Roman law, as compared to English women who live under English common law. And not all European women were free. They might be indentured servants, or they might be apprentices, which doesn't mean they're enslaved, but it does mean that their freedoms are extremely limited legally. And not all African women were from the same region, and not all women of African descent were enslaved. Although it was unusual, there were free women of African descent in the entire period, and there were also half-free women under the Dutch. There's diversity by age, which actually I have not talked a lot about in this particular lecture, because that just adds a whole other dimension. But here again, we have pictures of upper class women because that's what we have, but certainly the experiences of young girls, women of childbearing age, mature women, and elderly women were quite different depending on one's place in the life cycle. And finally, the term colonial women spans a very wide time period. We're talking about almost 100 years, from 1609 with the first Dutch and French colonies up to 1776, or we go through the Revolution, 1783. And not only, so there's this intersectionality where you've got each group and then change over time within each group. Okay, big disclaimer. I'm glad to give this talk, but I am not an expert, in fact, on colonial women. My actual field of expertise is 19th century working women who are in business. So I'm basing this talk on some decades of teaching American women's history and New York State history. It all depends on the research of other scholars, and that research continues to evolve. This is very important to know. We're still learning so much about women's history, and in particular, the history of formerly underrepresented groups like Native Americans and African Americans. Also, the topic of colonial women could be a complete course. It could be a complete college course. So we're just scratching the surface here. Okay, so the original women of what would one day be New York had probably been living here since the last ice age, or about 13,000 years, centuries and generations of women. And you can see here in artist representations that we imagine what they would have looked like. They would have been wearing deerskin clothes, generally. They are making baskets up at the top. They're living in communities, either in wigwams or longhouses in this area of North America. And we imagine them, I think, as possibly more peaceful than they were, because although they certainly lived more closely with nature than Europeans did, they were not always peaceful. Many of these tribes had long-seated rivalries and would go to war against each other. This is a map that shows just the placement of the major indigenous peoples, the major tribes. And the group who are most associated with New York are the Iroquois. And you see here how they stretched across the state: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, almost all the way to Buffalo. They were one language group. The peach-colored area is the Algonquian language group. And the major tribes within that were the Mohican, which is different than the Mohawks. I always think that's so confusing because they were on the border with each other and actually hated each other and were traditional enemies. The Mohicans, and in our area of the state, people called the Delaware or the Lenni Lenape. And you'll see here, the Iroquois actually are now referred to more properly as the Haudenosaunee. And they were all in the western part, as you saw. And then the Lenape going all the way down to Delaware. So from Delaware Bay all the way up through the Hudson, almost to Albany. And these are the native peoples who would have been in the mid-Hudson Valley. And the subgroup of Lenape who were in the Hudson Valley were the Munsee. And this is probably, of all the pictures I'm showing you today, the most accurate. It's a drawing by a Swedish artist who came to New Jersey in 1680. And you see here a Munsee family. So we've got the man with the arrows, you know, the bows and arrows. She has a hoe because she's going to be the agriculturalist. They both are wearing leather skirts. And then you have the little boy with not wearing very much except his, decorations and his little bow, which is so cute. And he seems to be, really having a great time. So both the Iroquois and the Munsee are part of this group called the Eastern Woodland people. And the Eastern Woodland people had certain things in common. They were matrilineal and matrilocal. what does that mean? It means that you find your descent through your mother's line and your mother's family, rather than your father's line and your father's family, the way that Europeans did. And they were also matrilocal. So when you married and had children, you went to live with the mother's family, not the father's family. This does not mean, sometimes I think students certainly would get confused and think this meant that they were matriarchal and women ran everything. And that's just not true. But they were very different from Europeans in how they imagined their families, how they saw themselves. The women and children did the farming and gathering, like nuts and berries, the foraging. Men hunted and fished. So there were actually gender roles. They're just different from European gender roles. Communities would get together for maple syrup gathering. This was an important part of their seasonal activities. Women treated animal skins for clothing and to sell, and women sewed clothing and made baskets. Two key things that we need to keep in mind is that these people did not have metal tools or utensils. So these were things they really wanted from the Europeans in trade. And they had no domesticated animals except dogs. So no cows, no chickens, no pigs. The women of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois have been very much studied because they had quite a bit of political power, and women's historians have been very interested in them for that reason. They were not chiefs or kings in their own right, but they nominated and supervised the tribal sachems. They chose speakers and speakers at tribal meetings, and if they didn't like what the speaker was saying, they could remove them and get them to reflect their views. They actually controlled the women whether to go to war or on a raid because they controlled the food supply. So if they weren't going to release the food, then the men could not go to war. They decided whether captives would be adopted or put to death. And once again, these are not entirely peaceful people. The Iroquois Confederacy in particular was they were peaceful within themselves, but they were quite warlike on the outside. And when they had captives, they could torture them to death if they decided to. And sometimes they did. And sometimes the women supported that. And women also approved treaties. So they have a whole political role that's extremely different than the private role of European women. Now, Munsee and Esopus women had some political role, but it's not as well documented, or at least I did not find it as well documented as the Haudenosaunee. They also lived in a somewhat more mobile and seasonal way. The Iroquois had palisaded towns, which were fairly stable. They didn't move with the seasons, although of course the men went out hunting. But for the Esopus, in the spring the men fished, the women cleared the land, and they planted the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash, as well as sunflowers. The families gathered the maple syrup. In the summer and fall, men hunted, and women tended the crops and gathered, and they made pits to store the food for winter. And in the winter, the men still did some hunting, and the women sewed and decorated clothing, generally with quills before contact with Europeans, and they made pottery and baskets. So 1609 is usually the year that historians say, okay, so now Europeans come to New York. Verrazano had come to the harbor in the 1500s, but he just, took his boat around and then left. So these are the boundaries of the areas that we're talking about. And you see here that Dutch colonization between 1609 and 1664 was pretty much limited to the Hudson Valley, a little bit in New Jersey, a little bit in New York Harbor, on Long Island. Whereas English colonization of the same period is spread up on the coast and actually also on the far eastern end of Long Island. In 1664, the English defeat the Dutch as part of the Dutch-Anglo War, and they capture New York. Peter Stuyvesant wants to fight, but nobody else does. So New Netherland, surrenders. And after that, you have the province of New York from 1664 to 1777. And you see in the other map, this red line, and this suggests how far New France, actually, Canada, French Canada, comes down into New York. The barrier was somewhere around Saratoga, and Saratoga was actually the site of quite a bit of fighting in the French and English wars in North America. And otherwise, sorry, you see the location of the various colonies. Okay, so in the beginning, there's quite a bit of cooperation between the Munsee and the Mohican who were around Albany, and the Dutch and the English. Why? Because both sides wanted to trade, and therefore it was important to them to keep good relations, even though there might be conflicts. And on one side, the Dutch and the English wanted furs. Furs were very, very popular, especially beavers, to make beaver hats. And in this period in Europe, beaver hats were the height of fashion. So they were very valuable. Previously, Western Europeans had been getting beaver from Russia, but that source was difficult to get to because of, sailing through the Arctic, but also the supply was running low. So this is one thing. And I always think that there's some suggestion that the native people just wanted some beads, this is something pretty. They actually wanted things that were very practical. They wanted cooking pots, they wanted knives, they wanted needles. They wanted things that would make their everyday life easier. So they've got a good relationship for trade, but also, and I think that this is something that people don't think about that much, both sides want allies in their conflicts. So the English want allies, Native American allies, against the French and vice versa. But the Native American tribes also want allies in their conflicts with other tribes. So in the beginning in North America, often the students would ask, well, why didn't they just get together and throw out the Europeans? And first of all, they wanted to trade with the Europeans, but secondly, the Europeans were good allies for them because they had guns. Conflicts then develop between the Munsee and the Europeans. So they've got these things that they both want, but conflicts arise fairly quickly. And this picture to me shows one of the major reasons why conflict arises. First of all, there are totally different notions of private property and land ownership between these two groups. the native people don't think of land as something that can be bought and sold. They don't have legal documents of the kind that Europeans do. They don't measure boundaries. They don't have fences. They share sometimes resources, or although there might be a conflict over resources, it has to do with who's using the land, not who owns it in perpetuity. The idea of owning it in perpetuity is totally foreign to them. But there also are really important cultural differences in terms of agriculture. Because the Munsee women do the farming, the Europeans think that farming is a job for men. Therefore, they feel the women have been put upon and enslaved by the lazy men of their society. And in Europe, men don't hunt unless they're aristocrats. So it's like, well, you know, the Munsee men are just lying around hunting and fishing. These are leisure activities, and the women are doing all the work of the planting. But even more than that, there's a problem in that Native American women used this kind of agriculture where you build in hills. So you put together a hill of dirt, and then you plant the corn, and around the corn you plant the squash and the beans, and they grow up over it. To Europeans, this looks like a huge mess. You know, when it's all done, everything is just on top of each other. It looks nothing like the straight plowed lines that Europeans are used to. And they don't think of this as really agriculture or using the land in the proper way. They certainly begin to use corn, which they didn't, you know, maize, which they didn't have in Europe, but they don't grow it in the same way. And they don't really respect this kind of agriculture, although it has been proved recently to be very efficient. Finally, there's no fencing, and then of Native American fields, and there are these free roaming European pigs, and they decimate the fields. Right? They run in and they eat everything and they trample everything. So from the very beginning, there are conflicts over land use and the way that people are controlling their land and their animals. In addition, I could just give you a brief example. There's something that happens, there's a war called the Peach War in the 1650s. And it all starts because a young Munsee girl climbs up in a tree and takes a peach in an orchard. And the Dutch farmer shoots her, you know, kills her. So, you know, somehow there's this idea of possession and property that's so completely different. But ultimately, there would have been a problem anyway, because in the beginning, when the Dutch and the English only want to trade, these conflicts can be solved. But when the Dutch and the English decide what they want to do is settle, then these conflicts are really irreconcilable because they don't want to share the land. They just want to remove the original inhabitants. So we've talked about the Native American women. European women, as was said in the introduction, include many different nationalities. So of course we have the Dutch, but underneath the Dutch, they had a lot of immigrants. So they Belgians and Germans and people from Scotland. And we have the French in the northern part of New York State. And then the English come in, and the English also attract a lot of immigrants. Immigrants tend to come to New Netherland and New York because there's more religious toleration. That doesn't mean that they can all practice their religion openly, in fact. There's there are Jews who come to New Netherland, and people make a big deal about how they're allowed to stay, they're not thrown out. However, they're not allowed to worship in public. They're only allowed to worship in private. The essence of Dutch tolerance is that you have freedom of conscience. There's not going to be an inquisition. But that doesn't mean that they have a lot of different churches. They have the Dutch Reformed Church, and that's the church that's official. Now, when the English take over, they actually allow building of more churches and even synagogues. And they actually allow a diversity of religion, not including Catholicism, though. There are, I believe, no Catholic churches in New York before the Revolution. So we've talked about the everyday lives of Native women. What about European women? So they are responsible for the household. That is true, but it's much more than we would think of in terms of the domestic sphere. They cook. They usually have a kitchen garden, which is things like herbs, vegetables, as opposed to food that they're growing for sale. They preserve food. They cure and smoke meat. They are in charge of taking care of the chickens and the eggs. If there's an orchard, that's part of a woman's domain. She makes cider. She brews beer. If there are cows, it is her job to do the milking, cheese, and butter making, which is exhausting already, but that's not all. Women also carried water from wells. They did the spinning, weaving, and sewing, laundering. If there were beehives for honey, they were in charge of the beehives. As with the native women, they also did gathering of nuts and berries. And they also were in charge of teaching small children, supervising servants, and assisting in any family business. So these are not just dusting, right? These are very, very busy women from morning till night. The final big group of women to come to New York are African women. And the first male captives come to New Netherland in 1626. They're actually, the Dutch are at war with the Portuguese, and they capture a boat, and it has these men of African descent on it. And they say, aha, we're going to enslave these people to the Dutch West India Company. Now, these people may not have been enslaved to begin with. They may just have been sailors, Portuguese sailors of mixed ancestry or African descent, but the Dutch didn't care about that. The Dutch West India Company, which was what was in charge of the colony, the sort of political economic unit in charge of the country, needed labor, and they were there to provide it. And a year later, so 1627, 3 African women arrive, and they're also enslaved by the company. So what does this tell us? The first women, they're actually Walloon women, Belgian women who arrive in 1621. This is 5 years earlier. So from the very beginning, this enslaved African population is part of New Netherland and then New York. And in fact, New York will become one of the largest slave-owning areas in the North. But the legal status of the enslaved people was fluid. It wasn't as rigid as it later became. So these were people who could own property, they could testify in court, they actually could sue successfully for wages or contracts. They could make contracts that they could insist be honored. They could be married in church, and they and their children could be baptized. This brings up a big question amongst historians. were the Dutch somehow better than the English? Were they nicer? And I would argue that, of course, generally the argument is that enslavement is always terrible, and that is true. But there's a little bit more complexity than that here. The Dutch did grant half freedom to very few people in 1644. The originally enslaved men and their wives petitioned, and they received this thing called half freedom. They're given land on the northern end of New Amsterdam, basically as a buffer against Munsee raids, right? So it's not the greatest situation, but they are able to create their own community. And the wives and widows can also own, own these farms. They get land in exchange for labor. They owe the company a certain amount of labor, and the company has to get a share of their produce. And the most important thing is that their children are not freed. So it's better than enslavement to the company, but it's not really freedom. At the same time that that's happening, the Dutch are increasing their involvement in the slave trade. So originally, they're just capturing people from the Dutch. Then they decide to dominate the slave trade between West Africa and North America. In the beginning, they take people to the West Indies, and then they come from the West Indies up to New Amsterdam. But a direct trade begins in 1655, straight from Africa to New Amsterdam. And in fact, Peter Stuyvesant is very interested, the last governor of New York, very interested under the Dutch of creating New York as a center for slaving. And the first auction of humans takes place in New Amsterdam in 1660. So to say that the Dutch were somehow better than the English, I think is wrong. So what do these enslaved women do? Generally in the city, they're domestic servants. But in the Hudson Valley, enslaved women are doing farm work plus household tasks. And in both cases, probably the most serious problem is that they're separated from their spouses often because they'll have different, people, families they belong to, and their children can be sold or bequeathed away. So these are the most important thing always is that families would like to be together. And in New York, that's very, very difficult. This is a really interesting painting, which is a child in New York, a very upper class child, and the African servant behind. Almost lost. Whenever you see someone of wealth in New York in the colonial period, there always is behind that person the economic system of enslavement. All right, I think that's enough about diversity. Let me just check and see. Okay, let me go quickly through the other misconceptions. That colonial women had no legal rights. They were controlled by their fathers, sons, and brothers. Actually, Dutch women had more legal rights than the English. They were not considered to be femme couverte or women whose legal status was covered by the husbands. They could do business in their own names. They could appear alone in court. They could sue and be sued. And they owned half of the community property in their marriage. Even in English colonies, although once you were married, you didn't have any separate legal entity. And if you were a daughter, you had to be subservient to your father until you grew up. Single adult women could own property and could act independently, both legally and economically, as could widowed women. And single and widowed women could testify in court and even act as lawyers. So when you hear about the limitations to women, Yes, most women were married, and married women under English law had legal limitations, but they didn't apply to all women. And also, my students always thought women somehow would be forced into arranged marriages by their male relatives. This did not happen. Finally, colonial women. I said that they weren't just housewives, they were producers. They're providing food, drink, and clothing, as well as items for sale and trade, at the same time as bearing and supervising children. And we've already seen what Munsee women did, what European women did, and what enslaved women did. Now, I have some stories of individual women, but I'm wondering if I should pause for some questions before we do that, because it's taken me a little bit more time than I thought. So what do we think?
If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and feel free to ask.
And if there are no questions, I'll go on and tell about individual women.
You got it.
All right. Okay. So, oh, here we go. So these are actually founders of New York's colonial dynasties. New York was a province that was dominated by the wealthy, who owned huge tracts of land on which they rented farms to tenants. It was different from other colonies in that respect, and much less of a land of opportunity than, say, a colony like Pennsylvania. All right. So I'm screen sharing, but for some reason I'm, okay. One of the most famous examples is Margaret Hardenbroek de Vries Phillips. She comes to New Amsterdam from the Netherlands, and she's a single woman who comes specifically as a trader for her family. She marries a wealthy merchant, and she does business in her own name while she's married, as she can as a Dutch woman, and then she's widowed. When she marries her second husband, whose name is Phillips, she obtains a prenup protecting the rights of her daughter from her first marriage. And she and her husband have some partnership, but she also does business independently. She owns ships and travels the Atlantic, and she gives birth to 4 more children. There have been arguments about her that, well, after the English conquest, she didn't have the same rights. This is just ridiculous. It doesn't matter because she remained an active businesswoman. She may have needed her husband's permission, but it didn't matter. She got it. And both of them continued to acquire wealth and property through her ventures. And this is a book that's been written about her. She founded she was a she merchant, built a mansion, a fortune, and a dynasty. So she was definitely a partner in the Phillips family, which became extremely wealthy and prominent in New York. Maria van Cortlandt van Rensselaer. She's born in the Dutch period in New Amsterdam to a merchant family. Before she's 17, she's managing her father's brewery. Then she gets married to Jeremias van Rensselaer, who is the patroon, or like lord, of Rensselaerwyck. This is a map of Rensselaerwyck. It's bigger than, it's bigger than a county. This is Albany here. This is Schenectady up here. It's absolutely a huge tract of land that they owned and developed and got rent from. She becomes a businesswoman. She supposedly had a better business head than her husband. And when the British conquer New Netherland, it's not clear what the status of this manor is going to be. At that same time, her husband dies and she's pregnant with her 6th child. And she writes at one point that, from that time, she was almost crippled. She was in terrible physical shape. The directors of Rensselaerwyck are all back in Holland. And they keep giving authority to the various male relatives who come over. And she keeps resisting that. And eventually all of them fail or they die. So she stays there on the estate and she oversees it. She trades wheat, she trades in lumber and beaver skins, and she makes the estate more and more profitable. She finally gets title for the property for her son, and then she dies at the age of 43. This is not a picture of her. There are no portraits of her that I could find, but this is a portrait of her daughter-in-law, her son's wife. So gives a sense of the money that comes into this family. This is Alida Schuyler Van Rensselaer Livingston, and she's the daughter of a merchant fur trading family. She marries one of the Van Rensselaers, but she's widowed soon afterwards, and she marries Robert Livingston, who is, somebody's described him as a sort of a opportunist con man. But in any case, she gives birth to 9 children, and he travels all around for political reasons and economic reasons and trading as far as London, and she's the person supervising their manor. She leaves numerous letters that she wrote to him, and she was actually the subject of a recent symposium from the New Netherland Institute where they analyzed these letters, which are mostly her complaining that he hasn't come home and that she has all this responsibility. But let me say, these are such inspiring stories, right, of women doing things. But all of these women depended on enslaved people for both their work and their wealth. On the right, you see the African, the current acting servants who are acting out African servants in the Schuyler Mansion in Albany. And on the left, you see the reconstructed heads of enslaved Africans whose bodies were found in a Schuyler property in just sort of thrown into a grave. And when they were digging for some construction project, they found these people and they took their skeletons and they gave them to forensic artists who rebuilt what their faces would have looked like. And their remains have all been reburied in a cemetery with some ceremony and respect. But this really struck me. The problem is, talking about these people, it's that they become a lump because you don't have names and you don't have, you don't have a way to individuate them. But this is a really interesting project where, as I say, they took the remains of these people, and this woman, they think, was 50 to 60 years old. She was about 5'4" and robust for her size. Even her back was muscular, where some of the vertebrae fused from arthritis after years of hard work, and they find quite a bit of arthritis in these skeletons. She had lost several teeth, and the ones that were left had cavities, and some were worn from smoking a pipe. Her left arm was shorter than right, and the base of her skull was misshapen, suggesting she may have held her head to one side, which makes one think perhaps she had been hit in the head, like Harriet Tubman. She was probably born in New York, but her DNA analysis indicates her maternal ancestry was from Madagascar, where there was an illegal slave trade at the turn of the 18th century. So one of the moves for women's history now is to try to give some individuality to the enslaved women who contributed so much, along with all the women in the state, right? Contributed so much, but were so little recognized. Finally, a little bit on change over time. As time went on, enslaved people, including women, were actually subject to stricter and stricter laws and more punitive control. Greater class distinctions developed between women of European descent. Immigrants on the frontier were very, the women had to work from morning till night, a life of constant labor, whereas the wealthy began to enjoy leisure and luxuries. They developed a whole culture of gentility, depending on servants and enslaved people. Indigenous families had really the most dire experience, because they estimate the loss of life for Native peoples would be somewhere between 40 and 90% from disease, mostly from disease, but also from warfare. Warfare between different indigenous peoples increases after the Europeans come, because there are conflicts over the fur trade. The Haudenosaunee take European captives for adoption or ransom. So there's an attempt to try to repopulate tribes with Europeans. And when captives are children or young, teenagers, they often fit into the tribe well, and sometimes don't want to go back to the European lifestyle. And the female political power of people like the Iroquois, which we talked about before, is undercut by European gender roles. And there's an emphasis on making Native American men more male and more patriarchal. All right, now I'm really going to pause for questions.
Anyone have any questions that they would like to share with Susan? I'll start.
Okay.
The way you described marriage for women versus women who were single, it sounds like marriage was a mixed bag.
Well, I think that if we think in today's terms, where it's all about independence and autonomy, sometimes like, well, why would anyone get married? But the truth is that people don't just first of all, they're from a society with certain expectations anyway, right? But it's also true that people want to have families. They want to be part of a community. Not in this period, the value was the family. We saw the dynasties, right? The value has to do with the family, not the individual. So these women are not necessarily thinking the way that we would think. There's actually a great article for the Chesapeake about how wonderful it was that the husbands all died so the women had more power as widows. But maybe you really didn't want your husband to die, especially because you're an economic unit. It's very hard for a woman to survive economically without a husband. And it's, I think that we underemphasize interdependence and assume that the greatest value is complete independence and autonomy. And that's not what any of these women were looking for. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I have a follow-up question. Could women hold in the colonial times, could women hold community leadership roles and elected positions? Do you know?
No. At least European women have absolutely no political rights. There's a huge landowner in Maryland who attempts to have a vote in the council, but they won't let her. So no, this is one thing that women just do not have a political voice unless you're a queen. If you're Queen Elizabeth or Queen Anne, You have a political voice. But that doesn't mean, can I explain it? People have all different personalities, and there are women who are strong personalities with lots of influence and respect in the community, but they don't vote and they don't have a political voice and they can't serve in office.
Okay, thank you. I see a question in the chat feature. Are there any diaries or missionaries? Diaries of missionaries or travelers which shed light on the lives of women during this time that you
know, there are a lot of records of this period not dealing that much with women. Now, in New England, see, the 19th century, the 1800s, there are far more diaries. Women in this period, European women, generally, they are generally literate, because if they're Protestant, they're supposed to read the Bible. But they don't usually have time to keep a diary. Toward the end, but they do write letters, but the letters tend to be sort of businesslike. Now, I'm not going to say that there are diaries of male missionaries to the Iroquois. There are things like that. But women generally were not, Native women are of some interest because they're exotic, distinct, different. European women are not of that much interest. But as I said, I'm not an expert. There could be some very interesting documents that I don't know anything about, because this is not my field of research. This is, just a field where I've learned a few things.
Anyone else? This is a great time to get those pressing questions you have about colonial times and indigenous peoples and life during that time.
Yeah. Either I've answered every question or I've just deadened everybody. It's always so hard to know.
Sue Gardner says an example of letters, I guess, of a diary is letters of Mary Penry, Moravian. It's a book, I guess.
Okay. So Sue Gardner, was Mary Penry in New York?
Sue, do you have any comments on that? Further comments on that?
Yes. Okay. So is this a book you would recommend?
Okay. All right. With Susan,
okay.
Very much. Susan, with women coming with the colonial times, people coming from different parts of Europe, Western Europe specifically, they have different. When they came to New Amsterdam, did they have different laws and customs that they had to adapt to, and did that is that particularly related to relationships between men and women at that time, and that they have to adjust to the New Amsterdam life, I guess, between how men and women interacted. For example, were women treated differently from Belgium versus the Netherlands, or from France versus the Netherlands, or or Germany, etc.?
No, I don't think so. I think that generally women in Western Europe were married under, as I said, Roman law. So for instance, the laws that women in New France were living under, also the wife had to agree to the husband. They were much more similar to Dutch law. The wife had to agree if the husband wanted to sell something. The inheritance was divided equally between sons and daughters. I think that, and people were, first of all, national boundaries weren't as clear at that time. They hadn't actually solidified, and people were quite mobile. So generally, the people who end up coming to New Netherlands often had been in the Netherlands before that. So, they would be refugees, they'd go to the Netherlands, it's hard to make a living. So then they're looking for opportunity and they come to North America. So we have Hannah Van Wyck's diary. Oh, enslaved persons were owned by the husband or the wife or both. They're owned by both if it's the Dutch period. They're owned by the husband if it's the English period. But if he dies, then they're owned by the wife. And if a wife brings enslaved people into a marriage, then they're owned by the husband. So for instance, when Martha Washington marries George, he's sort of penniless and he's from an aristocratic family, but he's a younger son. And she brings any number of enslaved people into their marriage, which then belong to him.
That's a great question.
So, Raleigh, you were the person who asked me to give this talk. So what did you want to find out?
Well, there's lots of different aspects about the relationships between men and women that have evolved, and I think you hit the nail on the head about, I think the word would be historical relativism. That we may assume people's desires and interests of today may be similar to the past, and as you rightly pointed out, that's not the case. So the desire for total autonomy, independence, and liberty, as we see it today, may not have been a top priority or as motivating force as it was, say, 350 years ago.
No, they were really looking for, first of all, in the so-called New World, survival, family survival, and prosperity. There's a note here that says the Huguenots settled New Paltz and they were Catholic, but I'm sorry to say this, the Huguenots were not Catholic. They were refugees again, away from Catholicism. They were French Protestants who had toleration before Louis XIV, and then there's an edict that says that they can't practice their religion anymore. So in fact, for New Paltz, they go to the Protestant part of Germany and they settle in a place called Paltz. But they're not happy there. It's okay, but there's not as much economic opportunity as they want. So even though they don't have any religious, they're not in danger by being Protestants anymore. They decide to come to New York, and they could decide to come to New Paltz. So there were a few Catholics in New York, but not many, except for, of course, in New France, the northern area around Lake Champlain, and they're all Catholics.
Are there any other questions anyone would like to ask at this time? This is a great time to do so. No?
No, and if not, I think we've spent our time.
Yes,
Anybody who wants to get in touch with me, my email is Lewis S, one word, @newpaltz.edu. And I did have a few things about women in the revolution, and should you ever like to hear that, that's another talk.
wonderful. Oh, that's great. We'll keep that in mind. Then if there are at this time no additional questions or comments, that I want to say a huge thank you to you, Susan, for a really fascinating presentation. And we're most appreciative of your time and commitment to researching and studying this topic, as well as women in the topic of women's history. It's an important part of our history. Everyone, be sure to join us at next week's benefit concert, where we'll surely be having a rocking good time. And if anyone again has any further questions for Dr. Lewis, feel free to follow up with her directly. On behalf of the Hurley Heritage Society, Susan, I'd like to say a big thank you. And thank you to everyone who turned out this evening for a great presentation.
Well, thank you. I hope you all learned something.
Most definitely did. And this recording will be made available in the coming days, so you can follow up and share with your friends. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Have a great night, everybody.
Goodbye.